I was watching through the security camera when I saw my husband of 32 years walking into my motel with a woman who wasn't me. He was holding her hand like a lovesick teenager, laughing at something she whispered in his ear. What Robert didn't know was that every step he took down that hallway was being recorded by the system I had installed myself. My name is Clara, and at 63 years old, I learned that there are betrayals that wound you and betrayals that set you free. This would be the second kind, though I didn't know that yet. For 40 years, I had built a life based on trust, mutual respect, and partnership. Or at least that's what I believed I was doing. Sitting in my small office at the back of the Sunset Motel, a property Robert didn't even know belonged to me, I felt my world split into two distinct realities. In the first, I was Clara Martinez, devoted wife, exemplary housewife, the woman who prepared dinner every night at 6 sharp and never questioned her husband's extra shifts at the hospital. In the second reality, the one those security cameras were forcing me to see, I was a fool who had spent decades funding her own humiliation. Robert was a cardiovascular surgeon, respected, successful, and I had always taken pride in standing beside him during his professional rise. I worked as a nurse for 25 years, saving every penny, quietly investing in small businesses while he accumulated accolades and recognition. What he never knew was that those little investments of mine had grown into something substantial. The Sunset Motel was just one of 4 properties I owned. There was also the small apartment complex on Maple Street, the commercial building downtown that housed 3 restaurants, and a modest portfolio of stocks that had performed better than Robert's expensive financial advisor ever managed with his money. I had learned early in our marriage that financial independence was the difference between being a partner and being property. My mother used to tell me, "Clara, a smart woman always keeps her own money, even if she never has to use it." She had lived through the Depression, watched too many women become helpless when their husbands died or left. I thought I was just being practical, building a safety net. I never imagined I'd need it for reasons like this. The irony was that Robert had always praised my simple approach to life. He loved telling his colleagues how lucky he was to have a wife who didn't care about expensive jewelry or luxury cars, who was content with our comfortable but modest lifestyle. What he saw as contentment was actually strategy. Every dollar I didn't spend on designer handbags went into real estate. Every vacation I declined in favor of saving money meant another investment opportunity. While he was busy being the successful doctor, I was quietly becoming a successful businesswoman. The difference was that I never needed anyone to know about it. But watching him guide this young woman, she couldn't have been older than 30, toward room 237, I realized that all my careful planning, all my quiet strength, had been built on a foundation of lies. Not my lies. His. She was beautiful in that obvious way that makes men forget they have responsibilities. Blonde hair that caught the parking lot lights, a laugh that carried through the thin motel walls, and a confidence that comes from never having to doubt whether you're desired. She wore a red dress that hugged her curves like a second skin, and she looked at Robert like he was the answer to every prayer she'd ever whispered. I recognized her, of course. Her name was Ashley Winters, and she was the new physical therapist at Robert's hospital. 28 years old, recently divorced, with the kind of energy that made everyone around her feel ancient. She'd been to our house twice for hospital staff barbecues, and both times she'd complimented my cooking with what I now realized was patronizing sweetness. "Mrs. Martinez, you must give me the recipe for this potato salad," she had said, touching Robert's arm as she spoke. "I'm hopeless in the kitchen." I remember thinking how refreshing it was to meet a young woman who wasn't ashamed to admit she couldn't cook. Now I understood she had never needed to learn. She had other talents. The irony wasn't lost on me. Here I was, owner of the very establishment where my husband was about to betray our marriage, watching it all unfold on grainy black and white monitors like some twisted soap opera. If the situation weren't so personally devastating, I might have found it almost funny. As they disappeared into the room, Robert fumbling with the key card like a nervous boy, I leaned back in my office chair and tried to process what I was feeling. It wasn't the sharp, immediate pain I had expected. Instead, it was something colder, more calculating. It was the feeling of pieces clicking into place, of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was solving finally revealing its complete picture. You see, Robert's emergency surgeries had been happening with suspicious regularity over the past 6 months. Always on weekends, always lasting exactly 3 hours, and always leaving him smelling like perfume that definitely wasn't mine. I had chosen to trust him, to give him the benefit of every doubt, because that's what 40 years of marriage had taught me to do. The credit card statements had been telling their own story too. Charges at restaurants I'd never been to, florist bills for flowers I'd never received, and purchases at lingerie stores that definitely weren't for my benefit. I had seen them all, filed them all away in my mind, and convinced myself there were reasonable explanations. But trust, I was learning, could be a luxury that some women simply couldn't afford. What Robert didn't know was that I had inherited more than just business sense from my mother. I had inherited her patience. The kind of patience that comes from understanding that revenge isn't a dish best served cold. It's a dish best served when your opponent is so comfortable in their deception that they've forgotten to watch their back. I owned the motel. I had access to every record, every transaction, every moment of security footage. More importantly, I had something Robert had never credited me with having: a sharp mind for business and an even sharper instinct for survival. As I sat there watching the door to room 237, I realized that this wasn't the end of my marriage. This was the beginning of Robert Martinez learning who his wife really was. If you're enjoying my story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what happened next changed everything I thought I knew about justice, patience, and the power that comes from being underestimated. The question that kept echoing in my mind as I stared at that closed motel room door wasn't whether I could forgive him. It was whether Robert had any idea what he had just walked into. I stayed in that office for 2 hours, watching nothing but an empty hallway and a closed door, but my mind was traveling through 40 years of marriage with new eyes. Memories I had filed away as insignificant were suddenly glowing like neon signs, each one spelling out truths I had been too trusting to see. There was the time, 15 years ago, when Robert came home from a medical conference in Chicago with a tan line where his wedding ring should have been. He laughed it off, said he'd taken it off while playing golf and forgot to put it back on. I believed him then. I wanted to believe him. Or the night he came home at 3 a.m. claiming his surgery had run long, but his scrubs were wrinkle-free and he smelled like soap instead of the antiseptic that usually clung to him after hours in the operating room. When I mentioned it, he got defensive, accused me of not trusting him after all those years of marriage. I apologized. I actually apologized for noticing. The pattern was always the same. Robert would do something that didn't quite add up. I would question it gently, and he would turn it around to make me feel guilty for doubting him. He was a master at making his lies sound like my insecurities. But sitting there in my own property, watching my husband betray me in real time, I realized that Robert hadn't just been cheating on me. He had been training me to ignore my instincts, to second-guess my own intelligence, to make myself smaller so his deceptions could grow larger. The cruel irony was that while I was learning to doubt myself, I was also building an empire. Every time Robert made me feel foolish for questioning him, I would channel that energy into work. The hurt feelings became business proposals. The sleepless nights became market research. The lonely evenings when he was at his extra shifts became opportunities to scout new properties. I had built my financial independence on the foundation of his emotional manipulation, and I don't think either of us realized it was happening. Around 9 o'clock, I heard them through the thin walls. Not the sounds you might expect, those I had steeled myself for. Instead, I heard conversation, laughter, the casual intimacy of two people who had clearly been doing this for a while. Told Clara I had emergency surgery again, Robert was saying, and I could hear the amusement in his voice. She just nodded and packed my bag like always. Sometimes I think she's getting more naive with age. My hands clenched into fists. Naive. After 40 years of marriage, of supporting his career, of building a life together, he thought I was naive. Don't you feel bad lying to her? Ashley's voice was softer, but there was something performative about her concern, like she was playing a role. Bad? Robert laughed, and it was a sound I had never heard from him before. Cold. Dismissive. Ashley, sweetheart, Clara has been living in a fantasy world for decades. She thinks we're this perfect couple, thinks I'm this devoted husband. She's happy in her little bubble. I'm actually doing her a favor by not bursting it. A favor. He thought his lies were a favor to me. Besides, he continued, and I could hear the bed creaking as he moved, what she doesn't know won't hurt her. Clara's simple. She likes her routine, her little hobbies, her book club with the other wives. She doesn't want excitement. She wants predictability. Simple. He called me simple. I thought about the commercial property I had just purchased last month, the one that required months of negotiation and market analysis. I thought about the investment portfolio I managed better than his. Expensive financial advisor. I thought about the business degree I had earned through night classes while he was building his career, the degree he had never asked about because he assumed I was just keeping busy. Robert Martinez thought his wife was simple, but he had no idea that his simple wife had been quietly building a business empire while he was playing house with his mistresses. Yes, mistresses. Plural. Because as I sat there listening to him, I realized Ashley wasn't his first affair. She was just the latest. The medical conferences that left him tanned and relaxed. The weekend. Emergencies that always seemed to coincide with holidays I wanted to celebrate together. The new cologne, the sudden interest in fitness, the way he had started looking through me instead of at me. Robert had been cheating on me for years, and he thought I was too simple to notice. Through the surveillance system, I watched their shadows moving behind the curtains. They were comfortable here, familiar with the routine. This wasn't a moment of weakness or a spontaneous mistake. This was calculated, ongoing, and worst of all, it was casual. I was being betrayed not in a moment of passion, but as a matter of convenience. I pulled up the motel's booking records on my computer. Ashley Winters had reserved room 237 6 times in the past 3 months, always on Friday evenings, always paying cash. But here's what made my blood run cold. She had been getting the friends and family discount. The friends and family discount was something I offered to long-term guests and local residents who used the motel for visiting relatives. It was a small gesture of community goodwill, and somehow Ashley had talked her way into it. She was getting a discount on the room where she was, sleeping with my husband. I scrolled back further through the records, my heart pounding as the scope of Robert's betrayal became clear. Different names, but the same pattern. Weekend reservations, cash payments, and that friends and family discount that someone had been authorizing without my knowledge. My night manager, Dave, had been working here for 8 years. He knew me, respected me, and would never give unauthorized discounts. But Robert had been coming here for months, maybe longer. Long enough to build relationships with the staff, to present himself as someone with authority. I picked up the phone and called Dave at home. "Mrs. Martinez, is everything okay?" His voice was concerned. Dave knew I rarely called after hours unless there was an emergency. "Dave, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Have you been giving discounts to guests who claim to know me personally?" There was a pause. "Well, yes, ma'am, but only when Dr. Martinez vouched for them. He said they were friends of yours and that you wanted them to have the family rate. He showed me his ID to prove he was your husband, said you two owned the place together." My grip tightened on the phone. "How long has this been going on, Dave? Maybe 8 months? He seems like a real nice guy, always very polite. Said you were too modest to tell people you owned the motel, but that you wanted to help out friends when you could. 8 months. Robert had been using my own business, my own employees, my own generosity as a tool for his affairs. He had convinced my staff that we were partners in the motel, that his mistresses were my friends, that I wanted to help subsidize his infidelity. Dave, I said carefully, from now on, any discount authorizations need to come directly from me. No exceptions. Of course, Mrs. Martinez. Did I do something wrong? No, Dave. You did exactly what you thought was right. Thank you for being honest with me. I hung up the phone and stared at the surveillance monitors. In room 237, my husband was probably telling Ashley how simple and naive his wife was, how easy it was to fool me, how I lived in my own little world. He had no idea that his simple, naive wife was sitting 50 feet away, recording every word, with complete access to financial records that would destroy him and a network of properties he didn't even know existed. But as I sat there in the dark, I realized something that surprised me. I wasn't broken. I wasn't even devastated anymore. I was angry, yes. But more than that, I was clear-headed in a way I hadn't been in years. Robert had spent decades making me feel small, but he had accidentally taught me to hide my strength. Now that strength was about to become his worst nightmare. The question wasn't whether I would confront him. The question was how long I would let him keep digging his own grave before I decided to bury him in it. After that conversation with Dave, sleep became impossible. I left the motel at midnight, driving home in a daze, my mind churning with revelations that kept reshaping themselves into new, uglier truths. Robert's car wasn't in our driveway, of course. He was probably staying the night at Ashley's apartment, living out whatever fantasy he had constructed about their relationship. I sat in our living room, my living room, since I had actually paid the down payment 20 years ago with money from my first rental property, and looked around with new eyes. Everything I had once seen as ours was suddenly divided into his lies and my naivety. The family photos on the mantelpiece now looked like evidence of my own self-deception. All those smiling pictures of us at medical conferences, hospital galas, and anniversary dinners. How many of those trips had included other women? How many of those celebrations were just intermissions between his affairs? I walked to Robert's study, a room I rarely entered because he claimed he needed privacy to concentrate on his medical journals. The door was never locked. Robert had always said he trusted me completely. Now I understood that his trust was actually arrogance. He trusted me not to look because he believed I was too simple to understand what I might find. His desk was organized with the same precision he brought to surgery. Patient files, medical journals, and correspondence neatly arranged in labeled folders. But hidden behind his medical textbooks, I found a small leather address book that I had never seen before. My hands trembled as I opened it. Page after page of women's names, phone numbers, and what appeared to be personal notes. Likes expensive wine was written next to one name. Available weekends next to another. Prefers afternoon meetings beside a third. Ashley's name was there, of course, but she wasn't alone. There were at least 20 other entries spanning back nearly a decade. Some had been crossed out, presumably when those relationships had ended. Others had stars next to them, though I couldn't determine what that signified. But it was the notes section at the back that made my blood run cold. Robert had been keeping a record of his lies. Told Clara, conference in Boston, actually Miami with Jennifer. Emergency surgery excuse, weekend with Patricia at her cabin. Late surgery story, dinner and theater with Susan. He had been documenting his deceptions like a scientist recording experimental data. Every lie he told me was carefully cataloged, every alibi meticulously tracked. This wasn't just infidelity. It was systematic psychological manipulation, carried out with the same methodical precision he brought to heart surgery. I found receipts tucked inside the address book, hotel bills, restaurant charges, jewelry purchases. But these weren't just hidden from me. They were being paid for with money from accounts I didn't know existed. Robert had opened credit cards in his name alone, cards connected to a post office box I had never heard of. My husband hadn't just been cheating on me. He had been living a completely separate financial life, funded by money that should have been going toward our retirement, our children's education funds, our shared future. I spent the rest of the night going through his study with the thoroughness of a forensic accountant. By sunrise, I had uncovered a financial trail that revealed the true scope of Robert's betrayal. He had been systematically draining money from our joint accounts to fund his affairs. Small amounts at first, $50 here, $100 there, but increasing over time. The medical conference in Switzerland last year that cost $8,000. According to the receipts I found, he had taken Jennifer Morrison, a pharmaceutical sales representative, on a luxury vacation to the Caribbean instead. The new surgical equipment he, claimed the hospital needed him to invest in? Actually payments for a timeshare in Miami that he used for weekend getaways with various women. Over the past 5 years, Robert had stolen nearly $250,000 from our marriage to fund his other life. Money that I had earned, saved, and trusted him to manage responsibly. But here's what Robert didn't know. I had been tracking our finances more carefully than he realized. Every month, I reconciled our bank statements, investment accounts, and credit card bills. I had noticed the discrepancies, the unexplained withdrawals, the mysterious transfers. I had even asked him about them. Investment opportunities, he would say. Medical equipment purchases. Conference fees that get reimbursed later. And like the trusting wife I was, I believed him. Except I hadn't just believed him. I had been documenting everything. Every suspicious transaction was photocopied and filed away in my own records. I told myself I was just being thorough, just keeping good financial records for tax purposes. Now I realized my subconscious had been building a case against my own husband. When Robert came home at 7 that morning, looking sheepish and muttering about a difficult surgery that ran all night, I was making breakfast as usual. He kissed my forehead, complimented the coffee, and settled into his normal routine as if nothing had happened. "How was your night, sweetheart?" he asked, reading his phone while I scrambled his eggs exactly the way he liked them. "Quiet," I said. "I worked on some paperwork for the motel." He looked up briefly, that patronizing smile playing on his lips. "Still playing businesswoman, I see. That's sweet, Clara. It's good that you have your little projects to keep you busy." Little projects. He thought my successful business ventures were cute hobbies. "Robert," I said carefully, setting his breakfast in front of him, "I was wondering if you might want to see the motel sometime. You've never actually visited any of my properties." He laughed. "Honey, I'm sure they're very nice, but I think I'll leave the motel business to you. Someone has to maintain professional standards in this family." Professional standards. As if his systematic adultery and financial theft represented professional standards. I watched him eat the breakfast I had prepared, watched him straighten his tie in the hallway mirror, watched him kiss my cheek goodbye before leaving for another day of what he probably considered a perfectly managed double life. Robert Martinez thought he was a master of deception, but he had made one crucial miscalculation. He had underestimated not just my intelligence, but my patience. I had spent 40 years learning to observe, to analyze, to build careful strategies. He had spent 40 years assuming that my quiet nature meant I wasn't paying attention. Standing in my kitchen after he left, I realized that my marriage had been over for years. I just hadn't been willing to see it. But now that I could see clearly, I understood that this wasn't about saving my marriage anymore. This was about justice. Robert had stolen from me financially, emotionally, and psychologically. He had used my own kindness and trust as weapons against me. He had turned my business into a tool for his affairs and convinced my employees that I was too modest to manage my own property. Worst of all, he had spent decades making me believe that I was lucky to have him, that I should be grateful for his attention, that I was too simple to understand the complexities of his important life. I was done being grateful. I was done being simple. That afternoon, I called my lawyer, Patricia Chen, a woman who had helped me structure my business purchases and who knew more about my financial situation than my own husband did. Patricia had always impressed me with her sharp mind and her ability to see 3 moves ahead in any negotiation. "Patricia," I said when she answered, "I need to schedule a meeting, and I need you to recommend a private investigator." "Clara, is everything all right?" "Everything is about to be," I said. "But first, I need to know exactly what I'm dealing with." As I hung up the phone, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. For the first time in years, the woman looking back at me didn't look naive or simple. She looked dangerous. Robert thought he had been playing chess while I was playing checkers. He was about to discover that I had been playing chess all along. I had just been letting him think he was winning. The question now wasn't whether I would destroy him. The question was how thoroughly I would do it, and whether he would see it coming before it was too late to escape. Patricia Chen's office occupied the top floor of a glass building downtown, with windows that looked out over the city like a hawk surveying its territory. When I walked in 3 days after discovering Robert's betrayal, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades: the thrill of being taken seriously. "Clara," Patricia said, gesturing to the chair across from her mahogany desk, "I've worked with you on 4 property acquisitions, and I've never seen you look this focused. What's happened?" I had prepared for this moment, rehearsed what I would say, but when the words came out, they surprised me with their steadiness. "My husband has been stealing from our joint accounts to fund multiple affairs. He's been using my motel as a meeting place for these women, convincing my staff that we own it together, and that I've authorized discounts for his mistresses. I need to know my legal options, and I need Everything documented properly. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her expression shifting from concern to professional calculation. How long has this been going on? Years, apparently. But I only discovered it this weekend when I watched him bring another woman to my property. I pulled out the manila folder I had prepared. I've brought copies of everything I've found so far. As Patricia reviewed Robert's hidden address book, the credit card statements, the receipts, and my own financial records, I felt a strange sense of pride. For 40 years, I had been told I was too trusting, too simple, too naive to understand complex matters. But sitting in that lawyer's office, I realized I had been building a case against my own husband with the thoroughness of a prosecutor. "Clara," Patricia said finally, "this is incredibly comprehensive documentation. How long have you been keeping these records?" 5 years of detailed records, but I have basic financial documentation going back 15 years. I paused, then added quietly, "I always knew something wasn't right. I just convinced myself I was being paranoid." "Paranoid?" Patricia's voice was sharp. "Clara, you've documented systematic financial fraud, adultery, and what appears to be a decade-long pattern of psychological manipulation. Your instincts weren't paranoid. They were protective." She was right, and hearing it from someone whose intelligence I respected gave me permission to trust my own judgment for the first time in years. "I also want you to meet someone," Patricia continued, reaching for her phone. "Marcus Webb is the best private investigator in the state. Discreet, thorough, and he specializes in marital fraud cases." Marcus turned out to be a soft-spoken man in his 50s with the kind of unremarkable appearance that would make him invisible in a crowd. When he reviewed my documentation, he whistled low under his breath. "Mrs. Martinez, in 20 years of investigating cheating spouses, I've rarely seen someone walk in with this level of evidence already collected. You've done most of my job for me." "What I need," I said, "is confirmation of everything I suspect and documentation that will hold up in court. I also need to know the full scope of what I'm dealing with." Marcus nodded. "I'll need 2 weeks to build a complete picture. Full surveillance, financial investigation, background checks on the women in his address book. But I have to warn you, sometimes the full truth is harder to handle than the partial truth." "Mr. Webb," I said, meeting his eyes directly, "I've spent 40 years handling partial truths. I'm ready for the complete picture." While Marcus began his investigation, I started preparing my own strategy. Robert thought I was simple, but he had no idea that his simple wife had been studying him with the same attention to detail that had made her business ventures successful. I knew his routines better than he knew them himself. Friday evenings were for Ashley. Tuesday afternoons, when he claimed to have administrative meetings, were apparently for someone named Jennifer, according to his address book. Sunday mornings, when he said he was playing golf with colleagues, never resulted in golf clothes in the laundry. But more importantly, I knew his weaknesses. Robert's arrogance was his biggest blind spot. He was so convinced of his own cleverness that he never considered the possibility that others might be equally intelligent. It was the same arrogance that made him successful in surgery, the absolute confidence that he was the smartest person in the room, but it was also what would destroy him. I began making careful changes to our joint accounts. Nothing dramatic enough to trigger his attention, but strategic moves that would protect my assets and document his theft. I transferred money from our joint savings into accounts that were solely in my name, accounts Robert didn't even know existed. I changed the beneficiary information on my life insurance policies. I updated the ownership documents on my properties to ensure they were clearly established as my separate assets. Each move was small, careful, and completely legal. But together, they were building an impenetrable wall around everything I had worked to create. The hardest part was maintaining the facade at home. Every morning, I made Robert's coffee and asked about his day. Every evening, I listened to his stories about difficult surgeries and demanding patience, knowing now that at least half of what he told me was fabricated. Every night, I lay beside a man who thought so little of me that he had turned my own generosity into a tool for his betrayal. But something interesting was happening during those 2 weeks of investigation. Instead of feeling smaller and more hurt with each revelation, I was feeling larger and more powerful. Every lie Robert told me was just more evidence for my case. Every patronizing comment about my little business ventures was more motivation for my strategy. The breakthrough came on a Thursday evening. Robert was at the hospital, or so he claimed, and I was reviewing the financial documents Patricia had requested when my phone rang. "Clara, it's Marcus. Are you somewhere private where we can talk?" "I'm at home. Robert won't be back until late. I need to show you something, but I want you to prepare yourself. What I've discovered is going to change how you see your entire marriage." He arrived at my house an hour later with a briefcase full of photographs, financial records, and documentation that painted a picture so comprehensive it took my breath away. Robert hadn't just been cheating on me with multiple women. He had been running what amounted to a sophisticated con game, using his status as a successful doctor to manipulate women into relationships that benefited him financially and emotionally while giving them nothing in return. Ashley wasn't just his mistress, she was his latest victim. Marcus had discovered that Robert had convinced her to take out a personal loan to help him invest in medical equipment. Jennifer, the pharmaceutical sales representative, had been paying for their Caribbean vacations because Robert claimed his assets were temporarily tied up in a malpractice lawsuit that didn't exist. "Your husband," Marcus said quietly, "is what we call a high-functioning sociopath. He uses his professional status and charm to manipulate people into giving him what he wants. And he's been doing it for so long that he's perfected the system." The woman I had been feeling sorry for, Ashley, with her young beauty and naive trust, was actually just as much a victim of Robert's manipulation as I was. The difference was that she didn't have 40 years of financial documentation and business success to fall back on. But Marcus had saved the most important revelation for last. "Clara, I need you to understand something. Your husband has been systematically stealing from your joint accounts for years, but there's more. He's been forging your signature on loan documents. You're listed as a co-signer on 3 separate loans totaling nearly $400,000. Loans you never agreed to, for investments that don't exist." My blood ran cold. "What kind of loans?" "Business loans, secured against your properties. If these loans default, and they will, because the money has been spent on his affairs, your motel, your apartment complex, everything you've built could be seized by the banks." Robert hadn't just been cheating on me and stealing from me. He had been setting me up to lose everything I had worked for, everything that gave me independence and security. If you're following this story and wondering how a woman fights back against this kind of systematic betrayal, stay with me. Because what I did next proved that underestimating a quiet woman is the most dangerous mistake a man can make. That night, as I sat in my kitchen surrounded by evidence of my husband's crimes, I realized that this wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was about survival. Robert had declared war on my entire life, and he thought I was too simple to fight back. He was about to learn that his simple wife had been quietly assembling an arsenal of her own, and she was ready to use it. The morning I decided to destroy Robert Martinez was a Tuesday in late October. I remember because the maple tree outside our bedroom window was shedding its leaves, and I watched them fall while Robert showered, thinking about how some things need to die before new growth can begin. Marcus had given me everything I needed. Patricia had prepared all the legal documents. I had secured my assets and documented every crime. But more importantly, I had learned something about myself that 40 years of marriage had hidden. I was not just smart, I was ruthless when protecting what I had built. Robert came down for breakfast, looking particularly pleased with himself. He was humming, actually humming, as he straightened his tie. I set his coffee in front of him and noticed he was wearing cologne on a Tuesday morning for his administrative meetings. "You seem happy today," I said, buttering his toast exactly the way. He liked it. "Just looking forward to a productive day at the hospital," he said, checking his phone. "I might be late tonight. Board meeting ran over from yesterday. Need to finish some paperwork." I nodded and smiled, the same trusting smile I had given him for decades. "Of course, darling, I'll keep dinner warm." What Robert didn't know was that I had called the hospital the day before. There was no board meeting. There hadn't been one in 3 weeks. After he left, I put on my best business suit, navy blue, tailored, the one I wore for important property negotiations. I looked at myself in the mirror and realized I had never worn it for Robert. He had never seen me in my professional armor because he had never wanted to see me as anything other than his simple, devoted wife. My first stop was the bank where we held our joint accounts. I had an appointment with the branch manager, Mrs. Helen Torres, a woman who had helped me secure financing for my first rental property 15 years ago. Clara, she said, gesturing to the chair across from her desk, your assistant said this was urgent. Helen, I need to report fraud on my joint accounts, and I need to do it properly. I placed Marcus's investigation report on her desk. My husband has been forging my signature on loan documents and stealing from our joint accounts to fund extramarital affairs. Helen's expression shifted from friendly to professional as she reviewed the evidence. Bank managers, I had learned, take fraud very seriously, especially when it's documented as thoroughly as mine was. Clara, this is extensive. We'll need to freeze all joint accounts immediately and launch an investigation. Are you prepared for that? Helen, I've been preparing for this for 2 weeks. My personal accounts are separate and secure. I have legal representation, and I have documentation of every fraudulent transaction. Within an hour, every account Robert had access to was frozen. His credit cards were canceled. The forged loans were flagged for investigation. When he tried to use our joint debit card for lunch that day, he would find himself standing in a restaurant, unable to pay, with no idea why. But that was just the beginning. My second stop was the hospital where Robert worked. I had called ahead and requested a meeting with the chief of staff, Dr. Patricia Williams, a woman I had met at several hospital functions over the years. Mrs. Martinez, Dr. Williams said, clearly puzzled by my request for an urgent meeting. Is everything all right? Is Robert ill? Dr. Williams, I'm here to report that my husband has been using his position at this hospital to conduct multiple extramarital affairs with staff members, and he's been using fraudulent financial means to maintain these relationships. I handed her a copy of Robert's address book, with the hospital employee names highlighted. Several of these women work here: Ashley Winters, Jennifer Morrison, Patricia Chen, not my lawyer, a different Patricia, and at least 3 others. He's been using his authority as a senior physician to manipulate these women into relationships that benefit him financially. Dr. Williams's face went pale as she recognized the names. Mrs. Martinez, these are very serious accusations. They're not accusations, Dr. Williams. They're documented facts. I have financial records, photographs, and recorded conversations. My lawyer is prepared to provide everything to the hospital's ethics board. Healthcare institutions, I discovered, are almost as concerned about fraud as banks are. The thought of a senior physician using his position to manipulate staff members and potentially violate ethics policies made Dr. Williams extremely uncomfortable. We'll need to launch an immediate investigation, she said. Dr. Martinez will be suspended pending review. I understand, I said. I just want you to know that I'm not seeking to harm the hospital's reputation. I'm seeking to protect other women from being victimized. By noon, Robert had been called into an emergency meeting with the ethics board. By 1 o'clock, he was suspended without pay pending a full investigation. But I wasn't finished. My third stop was Ashley Winters' apartment. I had Marcus's surveillance photos showing exactly where she lived, and I had a conversation that needed to happen. Ashley answered her door looking confused and a little frightened. Up close, she was even younger than I had thought, and there was something fragile about her that made me feel protective instead of angry. Mrs. Martinez, what are you doing here? Ashley, I need to talk to you about Robert. May I come in? Her apartment was small but tastefully decorated, with the kind of furniture that comes from IKEA but is arranged with care. She offered me coffee, her hands shaking slightly. Ashley, I said gently, I know about your relationship with my husband, but I'm not here to blame you. I'm here to warn you. I showed her copies of Robert's address book, the financial records, the evidence of his other affairs. I watched her face crumble as she realized she wasn't special to him. She was just the latest victim in a long pattern. He told me you didn't understand him, she whispered. He said you were more like roommates than a married couple. He said he was going to leave you when the time was right. Ashley, he's been telling women the same story for over a decade. You took out a loan for him, didn't you? She nodded miserably. $20,000. He said it was for medical equipment, that the hospital's financing had fallen through. He promised to pay me back within 6 months. Honey, that money is gone, and there's more you need to know. I told her about the forged documents, the systematic fraud, the other women who had been manipulated the same way. I watched this young woman realize that the man she thought loved her had been systematically destroying her financial future while lying to her face. "What do I do?" she asked, tears streaming down her face. "You file charges," I said, "and you testify when the time comes." That evening, Robert came home to find me sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a manila folder. He looked disheveled, panicked, and for the first time in 40 years, he looked small. "Clara," he said, his voice strained, "there's been some kind of mistake. The bank froze our accounts, the hospital has suspended me pending some ridiculous investigation, and I can't reach my lawyer." "Your lawyer?" I asked calmly. "You mean Patricia Chen? She's my lawyer, Robert. She has been for 15 years. He stared at me, and I could see the moment when he realized that his simple, naive wife had orchestrated his entire downfall. "You did this," he said, and there was something almost like admiration in his voice. "I protected myself," I corrected, "from a man who has been systematically stealing from me, lying to me, and using my own generosity to fund his betrayal of our marriage." I opened the manila folder and spread its contents across our kitchen table. Bank statements, photographs, financial records, copies of his address book, documentation of forged loans. 40 years of marriage reduced to evidence of systematic fraud and psychological abuse. "This is who you really are, Robert. This is what you've been doing while I was being your simple, trusting wife." He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, staring at the evidence of his own crimes. "How long have you known?" "Part of me has known for years. But I saw everything 2 weeks ago, when you took Ashley to my motel." "Your motel?" His voice was barely a whisper. "My motel, my apartment complex, my investment portfolio, my business empire, that you never bothered to learn about because you thought I was too simple to build anything significant." Robert looked around our kitchen, my kitchen, purchased with money from my first rental property, and I saw him calculating, perhaps for the first time, exactly what he was losing. "What happens now?" he asked. "Now you face the consequences of 40 years of lies. The bank is investigating you for fraud. The hospital is reviewing your conduct with staff members. The district attorney is considering charges based on the evidence I've provided, and I'm divorcing you." I stood up and walked to the drawer where I kept important documents. "These are divorce papers, Robert. You're going to sign them and you're going to accept my terms because fighting me will only make your legal situation worse." Robert Martinez, who had spent 4 decades underestimating his wife, finally understood that he was looking at a woman who had been playing a longer, smarter game than he had ever imagined. He signed the papers without reading them. As I watched him pack a single suitcase and leave our home forever, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: the satisfaction of justice, served with precision and patience. The quiet woman he had tried to keep small had grown large enough to eclipse him completely. 6 months after Robert signed those divorce papers, I stood in the lobby of my newest acquisition, a boutique hotel in downtown Charleston, and realized I barely recognized the woman I used to be. The timid wife who had apologized for noticing her husband's lies felt like a character from someone else's story. The legal proceedings had unfolded exactly as Patricia predicted. Robert was convicted of bank fraud and sentenced to 3 years in federal prison. The hospital terminated him permanently, and the medical board revoked his license pending a full ethics investigation. Ashley and 2 other women testified against him, and their courage in coming forward led to additional charges for financial manipulation and abuse of professional authority. But watching Robert led away in handcuffs hadn't given me the satisfaction I thought it would. Instead, I felt something more profound: closure. Not the bitter kind that comes from revenge, but the peaceful kind that comes from justice served and truth finally acknowledged. The divorce settlement was exactly what I had demanded. Robert left our marriage with nothing but a criminal record and the clothes on his back. Everything else, the house, the investments, the businesses he had never bothered to learn about, remained mine. As it should have been, since I had built it all while he was busy building lies. What surprised me most was how little I missed him. I had spent 40 years believing that Robert was essential to my happiness, that his presence made me complete. Within weeks of his departure, I realized he had actually been making me smaller. Without his constant belittling, his patronizing comments, his systematic undermining of my confidence, I began to expand into spaces I hadn't even realized I had been denied. I started traveling, not to medical conferences where I smiled politely while Robert received accolades, but to places I wanted to see. I visited my properties, personally getting to know my tenants and employees as people rather than just names on financial statements. I discovered that my business instincts, freed from Robert's dismissive attitude, were even sharper than I had known. The motel where I had first discovered his betrayal became my favorite. Property. I renovated it completely, turning it from a place of pain into something beautiful. The Sunset Motel now caters to families and business travelers seeking comfortable, honest accommodation. Room 237, the room where Robert thought he was so clever, is now my personal suite when I stay. Over for business. Ashley came to see me about 3 months after Robert's sentencing. She had lost weight, and there were circles under her eyes, but she looked cleaner somehow. Healthier. "Mrs. Martinez," she said, sitting in my office at the motel, "I wanted to thank you." "You don't need to."
"Thank me, Ashley. You were brave enough to testify. That took real courage." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You could have destroyed me along with him. You could have made me the villain in your story. Instead, you helped me see that I was a victim too. She was right, and I was proud of that."
Choice. Robert's manipulation had been systematic and professional. Ashley, Jennifer, and the others hadn't set out to hurt me. They had been lied to just as thoroughly as I had been. "What are you doing now?" I asked. "I'm back in school, finishing my degree. And I'm in therapy, learning to recognize manipulation before it happens again." She paused. "Mrs. Martinez, how did you get so strong?" The question stayed with me long after she left. How had I gotten strong? I thought about it as I reviewed financial reports that evening, sitting in my comfortable office surrounded by evidence of my own success. The truth was, I had always been strong. Robert hadn't made me weak. He had convinced me to hide my strength. For 40 years, I had made myself smaller, so he could feel larger. I had pretended to be simple so he could feel complex. I had acted helpless so he could feel important. But strength that's hidden doesn't disappear. It accumulates. It grows. It waits. My children, now adults, had been shocked by the divorce and their father's crimes. But they adapted quickly, perhaps because they had never been as blind to his faults as I had been. My daughter Sarah told me something that broke my heart and healed it at the same time. "Mom, you're so much happier now. I didn't realize how small Dad made you feel until I saw you without him." Out of the mouth of babes. Even my children had noticed what I had been too close to see. The business empire I built during my marriage continued to grow after my divorce. Without Robert's dismissive attitude holding me back, I expanded into new markets, made bolder investments, took calculated risks that paid off spectacularly. The woman he had called simple was featured in the regional business journal as Entrepreneur of the Year. But success wasn't the most important thing I gained. The most important thing was self-respect. I learned to trust my instincts again. When something felt wrong, I investigated instead of ignoring it. When someone tried to diminish me, I walked away instead of accepting it. When opportunities arose, I seized them instead of asking permission. On my 65th birthday, I threw myself a party at the Charleston Hotel. Not a quiet, modest celebration like the ones Robert had preferred, but a real party with music, dancing, and laughter. My employees, my tenants, my new friends, people who knew me as Clara the businesswoman, not Clara the doctor's wife, celebrated with me. Standing in that ballroom, surrounded by people who respected me for who I actually was rather than who I pretended to be, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Pure joy. Robert thought he was the story, and I was just a supporting character in his drama. He spent 40 years trying to keep me small, never realizing that small spaces create pressure, and pressure creates diamonds. I am 68 years old now, and I own 7 properties across 3 states. I employ 42 people, and I'm considering expanding into commercial real estate development. I serve on the boards of 2 local charities, and I'm teaching a financial literacy course for women at the community college. But more than that, I know who I am. I am Clara Martinez, and I am not simple. I am not naive. I am not weak. I am the woman who was underestimated for so long that she learned to use underestimation as a weapon. I am the woman who built an empire while her husband thought she was playing with hobbies. I am the woman who documented 40 years of lies with the patience of a saint and the precision of a prosecutor. I am the woman who proved that the most dangerous person in the room is often the one everyone ignores. My story isn't unique. There are women everywhere who have been made to feel small by partners who need them diminished to feel powerful. Women who have been called simple, naive, or dramatic for noticing what their instincts were screaming at them to see. To those women, I want to say this: you are not imagining things. Your instincts are not wrong. Your intelligence is not inferior. Your strength is not weakness. And if someone in your life needs you to be smaller so they can feel larger, they don't deserve to be in your life at all. If my story has resonated with you, if you've recognized yourself in my journey from silence to strength, I hope you'll share it with other women who need to hear it. Because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is remind each other that we're not alone, and we're not as powerless as we've been led to believe. The quiet revolution starts with one woman deciding she's tired of being quiet. The day I watched my husband betray me in my own motel was the day I stopped being quiet forever, and I've never been happier.